What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you a meta-analysis for the beginning of this February 2018 format. Ever since we got the February 2018 ban list, the format's almost just been blown wide open to an extent because, yeah, sure, there are some decks that are better than others, but in terms of where we were before, the hits on the Forbidden and Limited list actually make it so that there's a lot more viable competitive options as we move forward and deeper into the regional and YCS season. So I kind of wanted to give you guys my 2 cents on a lot of the decks that I think are very competitively viable and the reasons why you should or should not play these decks, just to kind of get a discussion going and really just start brewing how this format is going to shape up. But before we get into that, I want to give a big shout out to my newest patrons as always. So big shout outs today to Jaime, to Vladik, to Ninja Davy Boy, as well as Super Geologist. You guys are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me and the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. I'm going to throw up a pie chart here just to kind of show you the vast amount of diversity in the decks that I feel are very competitively viable moving into this format. And obviously, you're going to see that there's some better contenders here percentage-wise, but I want to kind of just delve into each of these to a little bit of an extent just so you guys kind of have a thought process as to maybe why you might want to consider playing one of these decks. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with the decks that have the most potential, kind of looking at last format, what decks were doing the best, kind of the decks that were showing up here and there, and then the decks that really had no chance last format, but that have a very good chance to maybe possibly do something in the upcoming format. So starting off with Pendulum Magician or Electrumite Magician. This is what I'm predicting, and a lot of people are predicting to be the strongest deck of the format, and for good reason. Obviously, Electrumite is an insanely busted card. It's one of the strongest cards we've probably ever seen in this game's history, and even with the Joker and double Iris banning that just happened on the last February Forbidden list, it really doesn't matter all that much. Now, it definitely affects the deck's consistency tremendously, but what you have to realize is the fact that the deck is still able to make Electrumite, the fact that Astrograph Sorcerer is still at 3, and the fact that the deck is able to end on boards like Naruto or Vortex Dragon and has access to the pool of monsters in the extra deck that it does, gives the deck just the high standing that it has. I mean, you got the Pendulum of Summoning Mechanic to abuse as well. You've got a lot of things going for you that make this deck really strong. Now, at the same time, the deck does have a lot of weaknesses in the fact that when you're going post-sideboard games 2 and 3, you're going to have a lot to worry about because Droll and Lockbird might start seeing a lot of play coming out of the side. You've got Dimensional Barrier, Unending Nightmare, you've got Anti-Spell Fragrance, you've got so many cards that really just hinder this deck's strategy and ability to perform that's kind of one of the biggest downsides. And even though the deck is forecasted to be the strongest deck, a lot of people are a little bit hesitant because in a format that's very well defined where Pendulum Magician is the best, there's a lot of really good counters for that deck as a whole that can ultimately end up being blowout cards and really not make the format all that fun. But we'll have to wait and see from there, but this is definitely the deck to beat moving forward throughout the rest of the discussion. We're probably going to be citing back to that moving forward. Now, the next deck is Trickstar. Now, Trickstar is here because obviously it went completely unscathed on the last Forbidden and Limited list. A lot of us thinking Reincarnation was going to go to 1, but obviously that didn't happen. But the thing is with Reincarnation not getting limited is that Reincarnation, Droll, and Lockbird is, in a way, the deck's only win condition in its core engine. Now, sure, the thing is, with Trickstar is that it's extremely consistent because you've got a million different ways to do things, but the problem is Trickstar has a really difficult time not only getting over big monsters, but you also have a hard time establishing a win condition as a whole because unless you got cards like Scapegoat or your blowout Droll Knock Reincarnation combo, you know, the deck struggles to really kind of just push itself over the edge to really be that solid tier 1 contender that a lot of people say. I think the problem with Trickstar is that while it's a very consistent deck, it's very reliant on the meta being established to kind of adapt because of the fact that it doesn't have a lot of key components and it's a very condensed engine, so that really what you can do is you can kind of play these cards that you might not be able to play in more traditional decks, which then allow you to adapt to the meta and kind of give you a solid tier 1 deck, but you're also playing all these cards that help you in these meta matchups. We kind of saw in the last format how that's kind of how Trickstar was able to perform. It's because it kind of molded itself to the Spiral mirror, or the Spiral matchup, and was able to do well in that instance. So I think what's going to happen with Trickstar is it's still a very good deck moving forward, probably one of the strongest, which is a little bit crazy to think, but at the same time, what might happen is I don't think initially we're going to see it have the breakout that we might imagine, but once the format starts to establish and define itself more holistically, I think you're going to start seeing Trickstar have an uptick because people are going to then evaluate and be able to adjust their strategy accordingly. Now this moves us to Spiral, the last of the big three of last format, and the deck that got crippled the most from the ban list, mainly because SPYRAL Resort went to 1. The thing about Spiral is, now that SPYRAL Resort is at 1, a lot of these other decks that were not in the top category of last format have a chance to be competitively viable this format. Now obviously all those other decks have obstacles of their own, but SPYRAL Resort being as oppressive as it was allows for these decks to do a lot of things that they're able to do uncontested because of that one copy of Resort. The thing is though, Spiral is by no means dead, because you have to realize this deck is very flexible and can also incorporate a myriad of different engines as well. We could see stuff like Brilliant Fusion. The deck could go back to playing Destrudo. There's a lot of different things that the deck can do, and it's a very good deck going first or second. Does it hurt that SPYRAL Resort is no longer a card in its arsenal? Absolutely, but the thing you have to realize is that was kind of just like the icing on top of it all, because this deck is still incredibly resilient. The cards in Spiral's archetype as a whole, if you look at them on paper, you've got cards that are hard removal, you've got Searcher cards, you've got a Monster Reborn. Like, the cards themselves are very, very above average quality, and I think that's why Spiral is still going to remain in the format in some shape or form. It just remains to be seen what that truly looks like. So now that we got the top 3 out of the way, I want to cover some of the other decks that were popping up here in and out from the last format, and now their viability moving forward. Starting off with 60 card Lightsworn Shiranui. I had a lot of high hopes for this deck moving forward, because now that SPYRAL Resort is gone, I feel like, on top of the fact that this deck also went completely unscathed on the ban list, Fairy Tail Snow is a real threat again. The thing about SPYRAL Resort is that it basically locked Fairy Tail Snow out of doing what it does, and that's one of the most annoying cards probably that any player has to deal with in this game's history. So the thing is, now that Fairy Tail Snow is back in full force, the fact that you have a deck that can just play just like 6 different engines and a million different starter cards and basically just play through hand traps very well, that's something that you definitely have to keep in mind. The boards that this deck is able to create, not only going first, but also playing through cards going second, is incredibly intimidating, and that's something you definitely have to keep in mind. The fact that this deck is just able to put on so much pressure at such an early stage, it doesn't even matter if the mills are good. The mills are frankly just bonus at that point, but the fact that they hit a Snow or they hit a Wolf or anything like that, it's just added pressure, just makes the deck that much more formidable. This deck was doing stuff before the ban list even hit, and now that SPYRAL Resort is gone, I think this deck has a very, very high probability to do extraordinarily well moving into this new format. Now this takes us on to ABC. Now ABC was another deck that was kind of hanging in there surprisingly, because again, Dragon Buster being an incredible card, but the issue is SPYRAL Resort was kind of locking Dragon Buster out from being able to do what it did best. But ABC is just one of those decks that wasn't hit on the ban list. Terraforming is still at 3, and is one of those decks that really, if you're able to just establish a Dragon Buster, look back to maybe a year ago when ABC was first released, Dragon Buster plus Dimensional Barrier was a pretty strong board, especially considering Dimensional Barrier shuts out the best deck of the format. So we might see some ABC Demise variants come out, or just some crazy ABC build, because Dragon Buster is that fucking good of a card. So it's definitely possible. Now, ABC does have its own issues, because it is a bit fragile in the fact that its strategy can be easily disrupted, and especially with all these other decks entering the fray now as well, it makes ABC have a little bit more difficult of a time. However, that doesn't mean you should discount the fact that ABC is still a very strong contender moving forward into this new format. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is Invoked, because Invoked also did very well last format as well. We saw decks like a Deceptions build that managed to top stuff like YCS Dallas and things like that. Invoked managed to sneak its way in a couple top cut slots, but very similarly to Trickstar, I think Invoked falls in that same category where it needs to adapt to the meta that's currently established. And since we're in this undefined format, I really don't think Invoked is going to have an immediate impact on what's going to happen. Invoked is weird because it's a very strong one-card engine, again, very similarly to Trickstar, but the issue is when the meta is undefined, you kind of don't know what the most optimal play is for the deck, and you don't really know what synergies can best flex to a deck like Invoked. I mean, we saw with Deception's build playing all these hand traps, that was very smart because the hand traps were able to stop going for Spiral. So again, it was very similar to Trickstar where it adapted to the meta that was currently established, and that's why it was able to do so well. So I think what's going to happen is we might see a couple Invoked variants come out of something like YCS Atlanta, but what's going to happen is, I think once the format establishes itself and becomes more defined, we're going to start seeing stuff like Invoked variants and maybe Invoked engines splashed into decks pop up in more instances because people are going to make that call overall. Now the thing is, there are some other decks as well that really didn't have a huge opportunity to shine last format, but with SPYRAL Resort getting limited and all the other changes on the Forbidden and Limited list, they actually have the opportunity to make a little bit of a comeback, and I thought that was worth discussing as well. Basically, decks like True Draco. You've got Masterpiece, which is still at 3. You've got Diagram, which is still at 3. You've got Card of Demise, Terraforming. Basically every card except for like Dynamite being unbanned and Ignis being at 1 is still at 3, and Masterpiece is just one of those cards that is completely oppressive, and if you don't have the right answer for it in the right instance, it's not going to be a good day for you. Now, the better decks have some built-in outs to cards like Masterpiece, and in some instances, it's not really that big of a deal. But in those instances where you're staring down a Masterpiece and your deck isn't properly equipped to deal with it, that's going to be a very difficult time for you, and it's something you definitely need to keep in mind moving forward into this format. I think it's a very big deal that Masterpiece is going to be able to come back, and don't be surprised if you see a True Draco deck coming up at the top tables, simply because not enough people were prepared for something like Masterpiece showing up. Then there's also Dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are, again, one of those decks you can splash with stuff like the True Kings, or now even Shaddolls with stuff like Overtex Quadless. I don't know if that's the best way for the deck to go, but you have a lot of good components here that weren't touched on the ban list. Oviraptor's still at 3. Ultimate Conductor Tyranno is still at 3, which is one of the craziest boss monsters this game's ever seen, and I definitely think that in some form or another, I think Dinos actually have some potential here, simply because of Ultimate Conductor Tyranno. Now, at the same time, Ultimate Conductor Tyranno is a little bit situational in the instances that it's good. It was good against Spiral because it's non-targeting. It kind of did some things that really disrupted Spiral's strategy, but at the same time, this is just a solid boss monster all around, and whether it's a pure build, a hybrid build, or someone just splashing some dinosaurs in like a 60-card variant, I wouldn't be surprised if you see something like this showing up. Then there's also Paleozoic, another deck I have high hopes for. The biggest problem Paleozoic face is evenly matched as a whole, but there's a lot of things that Paleozoic can do to combat that, like maining copies of Mind Crush. You've got Solemn Judgment now. You've got a lot of things at your disposal, Totally Awesome, for instance, that can help play around a card like evenly matched or help you deal with it in that instance so that you don't just get completely blown out by the card. But it also stands to see where if evenly matched is going to have a big impact like it did last format, because if the card isn't very impactful, less people are going to play it, which means a deck like Paleo has a better chance of showing up. Now, again, I don't know how that's going to happen because evenly matched is one of those cards that really just kind of depends on how the format shapes up, and if you're going against Pendulum Magician and they have a million spell and trap negates, it's not really going to do you that good to have a card like evenly matched that isn't really going to help establish and really equalize the field out. So we'll have to see. I think Paleozoic has a bit of an uphill battle, but it has a much better opportunity now than it ever did before because SPYRAL Resort is now at 1. And last but not least, I wanted to talk about Infernoid. Now, Infernoid is another 60-card deck, or 40-card if you want to go that route, that very similar to 60-card Lightsworn Shiranui, plays a ton of starter cards. It's one of those sleeper decks that always manages to kind of sneak up on people unsuspectingly, and it's one of those decks that can just put in a ton of work in the right instance. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if this is something that someone's able to concoct and craft and take all the way to a top cut finish of a YCS, especially in a format that's this undefined and people aren't prepared for. So again, it's just something to think about and a little bit of food for thought. We got a ton of crazy stuff going on. We might see a reduction in hand trap play just because now hand traps are just pretty much being completely shifted around because of the fact that the meta's evolved in such an entirely different way. The artifact engine is back at full power. There's so many things that have been basically breathed new life into this game thanks to the February 2018 Forbidden and Limited list that I think it's going to be a lot of fun experimenting and seeing what everyone comes up with. I'm excited, but I'm really excited to hear what you guys have to say in the comments down below. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video helpful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time. 1, 2, 3.